into a completely cliche love. Oh, hope he's a good guy. Have fun, call me when you get home. Instead of coffee, I led Saddam down the alley and crawled in through the basement window of the shelter, pulling loose the rusted iron grate over the window and slipping in. I'd seen homeless men do this late at night as I walked to the subway, and I kept it in mind for just such an occasion, though I didn't think I'd ever find it in the waves of tourists who wanted to know how to get to Quincy Market. The weather was good, the risk was low, and who would miss the Girl Guide for an hour or so? And his dad would tell me the anthrax spores would stay close to the ground. Almost every time, this is how it went. I would hang my Smokey the Bear hat and my green and tan uniform on the broken towel rack and turn the water on. I would be slippery and lathered, staring up out of the shower at the clouded windows and the feet of passers-by and their children's strollers. He would come in and gently uncross my arms from my breasts and scrub me. First my back, my legs, his fingers magical conduits, easing the cramped calves and tense spine. Then he would turn me around. I kept my head down. Saddam, the raven-headed messenger of Allah, in my mind, touching me. He would scrub my breasts and nipples and throat until I was raw and red, every inch a live nerve waiting for his touch. As it continued, I was never sure what it ought to be called. An affair? Simple fucking? My supervisor suspected us, and I began to notice jokes, lewd comments from the other tour guides. I walked by Saddam at every opportunity and watched as he doled out bags of steaming cashews and mylar balloons. He smiled always, but rarely looked directly at me, though strangely enough, I felt as if he stared, and I was somehow honored by that. He knew about my discomfort in my ankle-high socks and hiking boots, sprung at the instep from walking the concrete all day. He knew how my legs trembled after even a half day in the heat, and I would sit down near him on my breaks, and an icy bottle of water would appear nearby, a brush against my shoulder, a feathery kiss on the back of my neck when no one was looking. When we talked, it was about the weather or poetry. He showed me where Poe had been born, where Robert Lowell's family had lived, which way the Muslim faced to pray and when. He explained it all those things troubling me in the world. Palestine, Israel, gassing the Kurds, and all I could think about was what my father would say if he could hear those explanations. He would wonder where the U.S. was involved, always looking to put the blame on our government, big government, Zionist occupation government. I asked Saddam about my friend Butchie, who drove a tank over there and died, not in combat or from friendly fire like that football player, but ignominiously of sunstroke, his blood boiling in 120-degree heat. Saddam looked down, twitched his shoulder once, and began to tell me about the clouds of black smoke in formation over the Gulf the first time around. How he had sat there all those years ago in an observation tower, watching all that money burn away. He'd only planned to take over Kuwaiti satellite stations, he said. The world would have seen the true Saddam if he had, the loving, kind, and benevolent Saddam, Allah's chosen. And he cried great salty tears into his dark mustache. My sad Saddam. And my heart broke for him and for Butchie and the president, all of them floundering through what they thought was right. I brought him back to my apartment in Framingham once in late summer when the heat lay heavily across the turnpike and the fading light left shadows and murmurs even in my car. I remember I left the car double parked in front of the store 24 near the commuter rail. I chilled champagne the night before, cleaned the fridge out, set sprays of baby's breath and roses in the dining table. I pulled all the contents of my bedside drawer out, just in case, trying to decide what to hide, which information would be most damaging. I considered hiding the cyclovir, but bought condoms instead. When we had walked up the 3 flights, I held him back with one hand, opened the door, and flipped on the AC. Then I saw my father sitting on the couch, twisting a rose between his hardened fingers. His eyes were wet and shoulders heaving. "Hi, baby," he sniffed. Then he saw Saddam, and his eyes widened, and I could see myself and Saddam through his eyes. Saddam resplendent in his cashew-smelling apron, his burned, calloused hand holding mine, his hand on my back. "Good Christ," he said. "Pop?" I stood frozen. "I'm pleased to meet you," Saddam said. "Danny's told me so much." Saddam walked up and held out his hand. Pop just stared at it, then turned to me. "What have you done?" Pop stared at Saddam, then me, as if he would cry, and then he did. A great bawling, unmanly cry. "Rosie left me." Pop collapsed in my arms, nearly knocking me over in his grief as I tried to hold him up. God, or should it be Allah? Bless Saddam. He helped me carry Pop to the couch, cracked the champagne I'd gotten for us, and talked softly to him in that low, rolling, and throaty tone I love so much. Pretended he'd not heard my father, or that he didn't know what he meant, or that he didn't know that my father was actually asking him what he had done. I understood, though. Saddam talked through the evening and into the night, and Pop never looked at him but kept his head buried in his hands. Saddam touched him on the shoulder, walked him around the room occasionally, took him out on the deck for fresh air, and made him drink the fragrant Moroccan coffee I kept for special occasions. And I could only stare and add to the conversation once in a while. Ask where Rosie had gone. He didn't know. And what he would do next. He didn't know that either. And soon I just stopped. My father and my lover sat in a room with me, getting along, talking through a crisis. Not so unusual until I thought about who Saddam was and what he meant to the world, and then I just didn't know what to say or think, so I didn't say anything. Around 4 a.m., as I half dozed in the recliner, Pop and Saddam watched water polo and steeplechase and infomercials and the late-breaking news, plumes of smoke and deadness rising into the dry air of my apartment. They seemed so much alike suddenly, two men in the late stages of grief and grief help, at the flashpoint where the night becomes successful or not, where the grief-stricken finally laugh as the bitterness escapes, and the grief helpers just laugh in relief. Saddam just nodded gently, almost asleep, when my father excused himself to go to the bathroom, and for some reason he went to my bathroom rather than the guest half-bath. Through my bedroom, where he saw the condoms, the MDMA, the Xanax, the cyclovir, and the gun. Pop came out with my pistol in his big hand. I breathed once slowly, and Saddam held up his hands, as if in a ward-off gesture. "Danny?" I noticed Saddam's smile leaving as he inched toward the door, sliding almost imperceptibly. "I loaded it for you. Please stop it, Pop." "You should always keep the gun loaded." He smiled at me, eyes tearing a bit. "I know I taught you better than this." And he raised the gun slowly to bear on Saddam, who bolted toward him faster than I believed he could, this peanut salesman come dictator who I loved. I knew now, beyond my former capacity for love, whatever that had been. My father raised the gun to his own head, and Saddam jumped at him, and I watched as the two of them struggled, these titanic forces in my life, and Dad hoisted Saddam into the air with one hand, but refused to let go his grip. And finally Saddam stepped back, my pistol in his hand. Dad stood there panting, holding his chest. "For the love of this woman, your daughter, you should not kill yourself. There are better things to die for," Saddam said. He looked at me, his eyes full of love, and walked out of my apartment, my gun in his hand. Dad began to clutch at himself harder, eyes staring at me in mute appeal like a puppy, and I went out to his car to get a nitroglycerin tablet, which he kept in the glove compartment. Needless to say, Saddam stopped our rendezvous. Like any good man, he kept me alive through my grief and my refusal to understand, and sent me pistachios care of the school in the first part of the new year. I could open them, sniff, and imagine him handing me a balloon or scrubbing my spirit into life again. Then I would realize I was in contemporary political issues 11:30, which students would skip to smoke, and so in your empty classroom, and I would have to bite my lip to keep from crying. I left him a note pinned to his umbrella, another tacked under the wipers of his battered Ford, and once I left a more desperate note, the way women do sometimes. And I sneaked into the shelter past two homeless men drinking scope and waited in the shower, arms crossed over my breasts until the water turned frigid. So, waterlogged and red-faced, I crawled out of the alley and back to my job of historical importance and rectitude. Dad, or Rosie, no surprise she came back, call me now, almost daily, to see how I'm doing. I see the old news clips occasionally, Saddam firing his rifle with one hand, legions of Iraqis around him, and I cry. I watch the news before I sleep, before I take my pills, at every possible opportunity. I stayed glued to CNN through the fruitless search for WMD, the arguments about weapons and body armor and street warfare and death, and one day I saw him again on the news, not just word of him, but the solid flesh. Dad called my cell when he saw it. A spider hole, he said. Huh. I can hear him sucking on a tooth. What do you mean by this, Dad? I guess I'd thank him if I could. That's great, Dad. Bye. I think about that last night I saw him. I know by now they've shaved his head and beard, given him clothes because they have to, not because they want to, and there will be a trial for his crimes, and all the horrid details will wash across me once more while I watch, as I must. My father will come to visit me where I live now in Somerville, and we will see what we will see on the TV. I choose to imagine that the poems Saddam writes in his cell in Iraq under American auspices are for me, and I like to imagine that my relationship with him will come out somehow, that it will save him, that there are no better things to die for than love.